My husband let his friend humiliate me, ran to his ex for dinner to prove a point, and called it being an adult. I called my lawyer, and let the divorce papers do my talking. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not my husband. My lawyer. He said the papers were ready and asked how I wanted them delivered. I said, process server. To his office. He said, are you sure? He was giving me the chance to reconsider. Lawyers do that. They know how often people change their mind in the space between deciding and actually doing. I said, I'm sure. I said, Tuesday. Before noon if possible. He said he'd make it happen. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store for about 4 minutes. Not crying. Just sitting. Feeling the specific weight of a decision that had been building for 8 months and had finally become a thing you could hold. Then I went inside and bought groceries for one. Adjusted for one. That was the first real thing that felt like the beginning of the rest of it. He got the papers at 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. His assistant texted me. We had stayed friendly. She said, he just got something from a process server and he's closed his office door. I thought you should know. I said, thank you. She said, are you okay? I said, getting there. Let me tell you what led to 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. My name is Vanessa. I'm 36. I've been a physical therapist for 11 years. I work with people who are recovering from things. Learning to use their bodies again after they've been damaged. I am good at patience. I am good at understanding that healing is slow and non-linear and that you don't rush people through what they're going through. I applied that same patience to my marriage for 3 years too many. His name is Craig. He's 38. He works in finance. Smart, confident, the kind of person who always has a considered position on everything and can make that position sound like the only reasonable one. That quality was attractive for a long time. It stopped being attractive when I realized the considered position was always, in some way, a defense of Craig. We had been married 4 years when the friend situation happened. The friend is named Brody. I want to say his name because this story requires accuracy. Brody and Craig have been friends since college. 14 years. The kind of friendship that has its own gravity. Its own language. Its own set of rules about what is acceptable between them, that those rules then get applied to people who weren't part of the original agreement. I had been uncomfortable around Brody for most of my marriage. Not in a way I could easily articulate. He had a specific quality in conversations with me. A slight edge. Comments that could be read 2 ways. The kind of thing where if you said anything you'd be told you were being sensitive. So I didn't say anything. For 4 years. Then we had dinner. The 4 of us. Brody and his girlfriend Trish, Craig and me. A restaurant Craig liked. A normal Friday. Brody had been drinking. More than usual. He got louder. The edge got sharper. At some point in the conversation about work, I mentioned a patient situation. The kind of thing I mention in mixed company because I think what I do is interesting. I didn't use names. I described the recovery challenge. The progress. Brody said, that's very sweet that you think stretching people's arms makes a difference. Trish laughed. A polite laugh. The one you give when you're not sure if something was a joke. I said, it's not just stretching. Physical therapy is. Brody said, I know what it is. He said it with a smile. The kind of smile that means I'm being cruel and calling it casual. He said, I just mean compared to what Craig does. Real stakes. You know? Real stakes. I looked at Craig. Craig looked at his drink. He did not say anything. I said, actually outcomes in physical therapy are. Brody said, Vanessa, I'm just messing with you. Don't be so serious. It's Friday. I closed my mouth. Craig said, she knows you're joking. That was what he said. She knows you're joking? Not, that's not actually accurate. Not, back off. Not, Vanessa's work is serious and important and you're being dismissive. She knows you're joking? I sat through the rest of the dinner. I was quiet in a way nobody called out because I think they were relieved I was quiet. We drove home. I did not speak in the car. Craig did not notice or noticed and chose not to engage. When we got home I said, you let him do that. Craig said, he was joking around. I said, he said my work isn't serious. In front of his girlfriend. In front of me. Craig said, that's not what he said. I said, that is exactly what he said. I said, you heard it and you said she knows you're joking as if my job is something to be joked about. Craig said, you're reading into it. I said, I'm reading it correctly. Craig said, Brody's just like that. He doesn't mean anything by it. I said, what he means is exactly what he said. And you sitting there and saying she knows you're joking told him it was fine. Craig said, I'm not going to fight with my friend on your behalf when you're misreading a joke. On your behalf? He said on your behalf like defending your wife's work from a dismissive friend was a special request. A favor. Something optional. I said, on my behalf is your job. I'm your wife. He said, I'm not going to cause a scene because Brody made a comment. I said, I'm not asking for a scene. I'm asking you to not agree with the dismissal. He said, I didn't agree with it. I stayed neutral? I said, neutral is agreement when someone is being treated badly. He said, you're exhausted. Let's talk about this tomorrow. We did not talk about it tomorrow. I want to tell you what happened when I raised it again 3 days later. I had thought about it. I had thought about it specifically and carefully because I work with language and precision and I wanted to say what was true without saying more than was true. I said, when Brody said what he said on Friday, the thing that hurt wasn't just what he said. It was that you sat there and your response was to tell him I understood he was joking. That told him and it told me that you were choosing the piece of the table over whether I was being treated fairly. Craig listened. He had good listening posture. He always does. He nods slightly. He makes eye contact. He looks like he is taking you seriously. Then he said, I hear you. I think I could have handled it better. But I also think you have a tendency to take things more personally than they're meant. A tendency. More personally than they're meant. I said, what's the correct amount of personally to take someone dismissing your career? He said, it wasn't a dismissal. It was a tone. I said, he said real stakes. Implying my work doesn't have them. Craig said, that was poorly worded but Brody doesn't actually think that. I said, you know what Brody thinks? He said, I've known him for 14 years. Yes. I said, have you talked to him about this? He said, no. Because I don't think it warrants that conversation. I sat with that. He didn't think it warranted a conversation with his friend of 14 years. But he had just spent 8 minutes telling me what his friend actually meant and how I was interpreting it incorrectly. I said, okay. He said, I know this is frustrating for you. I said, okay. He said, I do hear you. I said, okay. I went to the other room. I did not bring it up again. Not because I was over it. Because I had recognized something in those 8 minutes. He was very good at making my concerns sound like my limitations. Very good at receiving what I said and returning it as a slightly different version where the original issue had become about how I process things. I had been listening to that version for 4 years. I was starting to hear it differently. The ex-dinner happened 2 months later. Her name is Lauren. I knew about Lauren. Craig and Lauren dated for 3 years before we met. They ended it. She lives in the city. They stay in touch. He had told me this early in our relationship and I had accepted it because I am not the kind of person who demands that their partner have no history. He had dinner with Lauren 5 times during our marriage. I knew about 4 of them. The 5th is the one that matters to this story. We had an argument. A real one. About the Brody thing resurfacing because Brody had made another comment at a group thing and Craig had again said nothing and I had again said something about it after and Craig had again explained to me what Brody actually meant. The argument was circular and exhausting and ended with Craig saying he was going to take a walk. He took a walk. For 3 hours. I found out later from Trish, who texted me the next day with a question that revealed more than she intended, that Craig had walked to Lauren's apartment, and they had dinner together. I did not find out from Craig. I found out from Trish's accidental text. She assumed I knew. She thought it was a normal thing I was aware of. I was not aware of it. When Craig came home I did not say anything that night. He seemed calmer. He said the walk had helped. He said he was sorry the conversation had gotten heated. I said, where did you walk? He said, just around the neighborhood. I said, for 3 hours. He said, I went pretty far. I looked at him. He went to bed. The next morning I said, I know you had dinner with Lauren. He went very still. I said, Trish texted me. She assumed I knew. He said, it wasn't planned. I said, okay. He said, I walked past her building. She was outside. We got dinner. I should have told you. I said, yes. You should have. He said, it wasn't anything. We're friends. I said, I know you're friends. The issue is that you had an argument with your wife, walked to your ex-girlfriend's apartment, Had dinner with her, came home calmer, and told me you went for a walk around the neighborhood. He said, I knew you'd make it a thing. I said, you lied. He said, I didn't lie. I said I went for a walk. I said, you had dinner with Lauren. He said, I didn't mention every stop I made. I sat with the specific energy of that sentence. Every stop I made? Like his ex-girlfriend's apartment was a coffee shop. Like dinner was a red light. I said, why didn't you tell me? He said, because you would have reacted exactly like you're reacting right now. I said, you predicted my reaction and used the prediction to justify not telling me. He said, I went to dinner with a friend. That's it. I said, after an argument with your wife. He said, yes. I needed to clear my head with someone who wasn't in the middle of the situation. I said, someone who is your ex-girlfriend. He said, Vanessa, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Lauren is a friend. The fact that we dated is not relevant. Being an adult means I can have dinner with a friend without it being a crisis. Being an adult. He had just told me that his maturity was demonstrated by having secret dinners with his ex after fighting with his wife. And calling my discomfort about it proof that I wasn't being an adult. I said, being an adult also means telling your wife where you're going. He said, I should have mentioned it, yes. I said that. But the reaction you're having is disproportionate. Disproportionate? I said, okay. He said, are we going to fight about this all day? I said, no. I went to work. At my desk between patients I called my lawyer. Not to file anything. Not yet. Just to have a conversation. To understand what things looked like from a different angle. My lawyer listened. She asked a few questions. She laid out some information. I thanked her and said I'd be in touch. On the drive home I thought about the word disproportionate. He had used it about my reaction to the dinner. He had used similar language about my reaction to the Brody situation. He had used it, in some form, about most of my concerns for most of our marriage. I thought about how many times I had adjusted my reaction because he told me it was too large. How many times I had accepted the smaller version of my own experience because he presented a more measured interpretation. I thought about the word adult. The way he used it to mean agreeable. To mean not reacting. To mean accepting whatever was happening as normal and reasonable. I thought about what I would tell a patient who was in pain and whose doctor kept explaining that the pain was probably in their head. I would tell them to get a second opinion. The second opinion was my lawyer's full consultation 2 weeks later. I want to tell you about that meeting because it matters. I sat across from her and I told her everything. Chronologically. Not just the Brody situation and the Lauren dinner. Everything. 4 years of patterns. 4 years of having my concerns reframed as my limitations. 4 years of being told I was too sensitive, reading too much into things, reacting disproportionately. She listened. She took notes. When I was done she said, has he ever been physically threatening? I said, no. Never. She said, financially controlling? I said, no. We have separate accounts and a joint account. Equitable. She said, has he isolated you from friends or family? I said, no. She said, I want to ask you something and I want you to think about it before you answer. I said, okay. She said, when you bring a concern to him, what happens to the concern? I thought about it. I said, it becomes a conversation about how I'm processing the concern. She said, yes. I said, he's very good at listening and then returning what I said as a version that's about my tendencies instead of about the actual thing. She said, and over time? I said, over time I've brought fewer concerns. She said, yes. She said, I'm not here to diagnose your marriage. I'm here to help you understand your options. But I want you to know that what you're describing has a name and the name matters. She told me the name. I had heard it before. I had just never applied it to my own life because my life did not look like the extreme versions. He had never yelled. Never threatened. Never controlled money or access or friendships. He had just, for 4 years, been very good at making my reality slightly smaller than it actually was. I made a decision in that office. Not out of anger. Not in a fight. Not in a moment of drama. I made it the way I make clinical decisions. With information. With clarity. With the understanding that waiting longer was not going to produce different information. I told her to prepare the papers. The 48 hours between the lawyer conversation and the papers being served. I did not tell Craig what was coming. I want to address that directly because some people will say I should have. That it was unfair. That he deserved a final conversation. Here is what I know. I had been having conversations with Craig for 4 years. In those conversations, he had consistently returned my concerns as evidence of my limitations. He was skilled at it, practiced, possibly without even knowing he was doing it. If I had told him the papers were coming, there would have been a conversation. He would have listened. He would have made eye contact. He would have acknowledged that he could have handled some things better. And then he would have made the case, thoughtfully and with evident reasonableness, that my decision was disproportionate. He would have been very convincing. I know this because he had been very convincing for 4 years. I chose the papers instead. Not cruelty. Clarity. Sometimes the only language someone actually hears is the one they cannot reframe. He called me at 11:31 a.m. 17 minutes after the process server left his office. I did not pick up. He called again at 11:43. I did not pick up. He texted at 11:47. He said, "Vanessa, please call me." At 11:52. "We need to talk." I mean it. At 12:03. This is not how adults handle things. There it was. This is not how adults handle things. I had filed for divorce after a prolonged pattern of having my concerns minimized. After being lied to about where he spent an evening. After being told that my discomfort with a humiliating dinner was disproportionate. After being told that having secret dinner with his ex was being an adult. And when I responded with the only language he hadn't yet been able to reframe, the text he sent was, "This is not how adults handle things." I looked at that text for a long time. Then I called my friend Keisha. She had known this was coming. She had been the person I'd talk to when I couldn't talk to Craig. She had the specific quality of a good friend, which is that she makes you feel like your version of events is worth hearing. She picked up. She said, "Well?" I said, "He got the papers." She said, "What did he say?" I said, "He texted that this is not how adults handle things." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I cannot." I said, "I know." She said, "After the Lauren dinner," he said. I said, "Being an adult means I can have dinner with a friend." Yes. She said, "So being an adult means he can do what he wants. And not being an adult means you filing for divorce." I said, "That's the framework." She said, "Vanessa?" I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes. Actually, yes. Not performing, yes." She said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "I'm going grocery shopping later. I'm buying things for one person." She was quiet. I said, "That sentence made me feel more okay than anything else today." She said, "I'll come with you." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to see you buy groceries for one person. That's a thing I want to witness." I said, "Okay." She came. We bought groceries. She made me get the good olive oil because she said starting a new life with bad olive oil was not an option she was willing to accept. We had dinner at my place. It was the best evening I'd had in months. He texted 4 more times that afternoon. He called twice that evening. I did not pick up either call. At 8:47 p.m. he texted something longer. He said, "I understand you're angry. I know I've made mistakes. I'm asking you to let me have a conversation before we make this permanent. I think you owe me that. I owe me that." He thought I owed him one more conversation. I thought about 4 years of conversations. 4 years of bringing something true to the table and watching it get returned to me as something slightly different. 4 years of considered positions that always, in some way, landed back on what I was doing wrong or reading incorrectly or processing too intensely. I did not respond. The next morning he showed up at the apartment. He knocked. I did not open the door. I heard him outside. He said my name twice. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he was not leaving until we talked. I called my lawyer. She told me what I could do if he didn't leave. I waited. He left after 22 minutes. He texted once more. Said he would give me space but that he hoped I would call him when I was ready. I did not call him when I was ready. I called my lawyer when I was ready. The divorce took 8 months. He had a lawyer too. His lawyer was good. Craig was well-resourced and organized and had strong positions on everything. The process was not easy. It was not fast. It was not without moments where I questioned whether the papers had been the right call. In those moments I thought about one specific thing. The text. This is not how adults handle things. 4 years of being told how to handle things. How to react. How large to make my concerns. What was proportionate. What Brody actually meant. What Lauren actually was. What being an adult actually looked like. And when I finally handled something in a way he hadn't scripted, when I finally used a language he couldn't receive and return as a slightly smaller version, the response was, "You're not doing this right." I held that text when things got hard. It reminded me exactly why the papers had been the right call. 8 months later, the divorce was final. I want to tell you about the first morning after. I woke up in my apartment. The one I'd moved into 6 months earlier. Smaller than where we'd lived. Better light. Nearer park. The kind of place that feels like a choice instead of a compromise. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about the word adult. How he'd used it? What he'd meant. The way he'd applied it to his own choices and withdrawn it from mine. I thought about what adult actually means. Adult means being responsible for what you do. It means when someone is being treated badly in front of you, you say something. It means when you go somewhere you tell the person who lives with you. It means when your wife brings you a concern you engage with the concern instead of the way she's bringing it. Adult means being honest. He'd used the word to mean the opposite of all those things. I'd spent 4 years trying to match his definition. I finished my coffee. I got dressed. I went for a walk in the park. It was a Tuesday. Clear. A little cold. The kind of morning where you can feel the air. I walked for 40 minutes and thought about nothing important. Which is its own kind of important. Brody texted me once during the divorce. I don't know how he got my number or why he decided to use it. He said, "I heard what happened. For what it's worth, I always thought you were good for Craig." I read it twice. I always thought you were good for Craig. Not, "I'm sorry about the dinner." Not, "I heard Craig handled things badly." Not even a direct acknowledgement of what had happened. Just an observation about my utility to the man I was divorcing. I did not respond. Keisha asked me once, about 3 months after the divorce was final, whether I regretted anything. I said, "I regret not trusting my Reed earlier." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I knew something was wrong in year 2. The way he handled concerns. The pattern. I could see it, but I kept accepting his version of it because his version was so calm and so considered, and he was so good at making my version sound like the high-strung one." She said, "What changed?" I said, "The word adult." I said, "When he said being an adult means I can have dinner with Lauren after a fight with you." That was the first time I heard the language clearly enough to understand what it was doing. She said, "What was it doing?" I said, "It was making his choices mature and my responses immature. Automatically. Whatever he did was adult. Whatever I felt about it was not." Keisha said, "And the papers?" I said, "The papers were the first thing I did that he couldn't receive and reframe. He couldn't explain the papers away. He couldn't tell me the papers were disproportionate in a way that would change what they said." She said, "So the papers were the first honest conversation?" I said, "Exactly." She said, "How does that feel now?" I thought about it. I said, "Clean." I said, "The same way an accurate diagnosis feels. You didn't want the diagnosis. But at least now you're treating the actual thing." Here is the only thing I want you to take from this. There is a specific kind of person who is very skilled at being right about your feelings. Not about facts. About your feelings. You bring them a concern. They hear it. They nod. They acknowledge it. And then they return it as something slightly different. Something that has your name on it but the shape of your limitation. Too sensitive. Disproportionate. Reading into it. Taking it personally. Not being an adult about it. Over time you start to bring fewer concerns. Not because you have fewer. Because the cost of bringing them is that you spend the next hour defending how you arrived at them. You learn to make yourself smaller. You do it slowly. Without noticing. And then one day someone says, "Being an adult means I can have dinner with my ex after fighting with you." And something in you hears it clearly for the first time. Not the content. The structure. The way his maturity and your reaction are always on opposite sides of the same sentence. I called my lawyer. I said, "Process server." To his office. Before noon if possible. He got the papers at 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. He texted, "This is not how adults handle things." I bought groceries for one. The good olive oil. That was enough.